Thank you for that tumultuous applause. I'm overwhelmed already. So most of my life, I've been very curious and very interested in nature versus nurture, where to a balance. Then as I got more deeper into anger management, teaching anger management, I wanted to know what we could control, what we couldn't control. And so I've always ended up teaching classes somewhere on the things that I need to learn or choose to learn. So I taught a class on nature versus nurture about 6 years ago. That led me into another level where I wanted to go on. And so I've taken some college courses on neurology, and here I are. So tonight I want to share some things on how you've already created your brain, how you did that, why you did that, what you can change back if you choose to. I'm going to talk a little bit about red flags and noticing what's going on inside your body and why you should care about that. Then we're going to spend some time talking about some of the techniques to change. Some of them you will know, everybody will learn some and see some familiar with. I've got about 24 that I'll share, but you all have some too. So let's begin with the program. When I also taught this at a peace conference, and I talked about the interrelationships, and that's another subject. Let's get into the real meat of this. And if you want to press on the little bar at the top right on the window screens, then you'll have the full picture of the brain itself. The brain does function very strongly in three separate parts. And though there is some interconnection, there is a lot of separation. As the reptilian brain, of course, is what you find in animals, but it's at our base stem. And that's the part that causes fight, flight, causes us to eat, causes us to reproduce. And that's about it. It's just basic existence. If you go to step on a spider, you'll see the spider run away. So that's it. It is aware of danger, so it will flight. Then somewhere, and this started about 2 million years ago when we were standing upright. Then later, we developed that middle part, which is referred to as the mammalian brain. Some books will refer to this as the lizard brain, and we'll talk about that later. But there's technically, it's the limbic system. It's your primarily emotional system. It's where your long-term memory, your library is, and a lot of other bodily functions. Whereas the reptilian brain, is pretty much your heart and a lot of things. The mammalian brain is your temperature control and a lot of detail controls. It tells you when you're hungry. It tells you when you're full, whether you listen or not. It tells you when you need to drink. And if it tells you when you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. So let's not wait until the body tells us we're thirsty. We need to drink more water. Then about 200,000 years ago, all of a sudden the Homo sapiens brain became much larger. And then that's when we realized that we were beginning to develop the cortex. So the three sections really did develop separately. At birth, your reptilian brain is the only thing really functioning. As a matter of fact, you have no functioning cortex, and there is no sensitivity at birth. There's no emotion, no feelings, because all you have is reptilian brain. Part of the reason for that is very simply, it's all you can get out of the birth canal. If you had a very large head and a very big brain, it would even hurt worse. So the only thing you have functioning is literally the reptilian brain. However, the instant you come out and see daylight, all kinds of things are suddenly changing. The way you intake of food, the way you process food, you're beginning to feel things, the bright lights, the temperature changes, somebody touching you, so your touch is different. So what's happened is at that particular point, you have a lot of neurons, which we'll show you later. You have millions of neurons that are not connected doing anything. But those actions and those feelings and those motions begin to cause connections. It's actually what we call a synapse. Many of you have probably heard the word today, synapse. And the synapse is that tiny space between neurons. Neurons never truly physically connect. There's a space in between. And in that space, literally life is happening. But you're making connections. When you begin to have experiences, thoughts, feelings, you are literally at that point connecting millions upon millions of the neurons, the brain cells. So we begin to create our own brain. Now, every scientist pretty well agrees that the neocortex is not fully developed. The thinking brain is not fully developed until you're around 25. Until 1995, we used to tell you that take care of your brain carefully because that's all of the brain cells you're ever going to get. And that's in many textbooks today. It wasn't until 1995 that we learned that that was true. As a matter of fact, up until 1995, the only way we knew anything about the brain is either from rats or from people who had accidents and damage. An individual would have an accident and lose a particular portion of the brain, and we'd go in and analyze to see what you lost. Soldiers returning from the Second World War, from Vietnam, and we would be looking at what piece of part of the brain would be lost, how would it affect. It was not until 1995 till they created the fMRI, the machine that would read and watch a brain in a living person. So it's 1995, the technology and knowledge on the brain has just exploded. This is also why you're finding suddenly everything is named neuro something, neuroprocessing, neuroimaging, neuro shoes, neuro everything, because of our knowledge of the brain recently. So the thinking part of the brain is the last to develop. So thusly, that cortex, that thinking part of the brain, the part that we sometimes call the wizard part, is the last to develop and the most affected by epigenetics. The word EPI means outside. So the genes are affected on the outside by our environment, by our experiences, by the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, everything that's going on outside of us will greatly affect the cortex. Because it's important to recognize that the DNA is a blueprint. A DNA is not an absolute structure. It's the blueprint of how your body will be built. But just as a contractor will take a blueprint from an architect, they may move a room around a little bit and modify this or that. So we can be affected. And what I teach is we are 50% DNA, 50% environment. However, so were your parents, so were your grandparents, so were your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. So the DNA becomes a formation from millenniums virtually, which leads us to the amygdala. The amygdala is our, well, let's go first. The sensory cortex, the brain, sits at the top. The sensory thalamus, the amygdala, are part of the limbic system, the mammalian brain, along with the hippocampus, which is your library. We'll talk about that later. The important thing here to recognize is all input, what you hear, what you feel, what you see, what you taste, enters the thalamus, the limbic first, before the cortex is even aware. It takes 2/10 of a second for information to register on the amygdala, but it takes more than 7/10 of a second to register in the cortex. This is why people tend to blow off the handle because they have separated their cortex, and we'll talk about how that happens. But we become disconnected for our cortex, so we jump to conclusions. Not that long ago, the policeman that shot the gentleman of color that was holding his cell phone, in the 2/10 of a second, his amygdala, which is designed to protect you, told him he has something in his hand. And of course, the policeman responded accordingly. Then he realized what it was. But we have completely bypassed, when we get tense and nervous, we completely bypass the sensory cortex. So the mammalian brain, primarily the amygdala, is our emotional center. And it literally is designed to protect us. When we're running away from saber-toothed tigers, the amygdala was very, very important. It doesn't serve quite the same purpose today, but it's still there and still very active. And by the way, if any of you have questions, just holler out question and I'll stop and we'll talk about that. So we live 98% of our life in the mammalian brain, in the thalamus, in the amygdala, in all of the limbic system, which is below the cortex. We live 98% of our life in that. To connect to that sensory cortex actually takes work. It takes effort. The arrows from the sensory thalamus up to the sensory cortex, they call it a paved highway. But the sensory cortex down to the amygdala is a dirt road. So we have good connections up, but we have very slow, very poor connections down. We live 98% of the time in the amygdala. Have any of you ever lost car keys or had trouble finding your glasses or gone into the other room to get something and then get there and forget what you got or went in to get? Has that ever happened to anyone?
Regularly, Jim. Regularly.
Yes.
All the time.
Well, I didn't know if I was the only one or not, and it's possible. What happens, we live, again, 98% of the time, and typically in a normal day, we come in from driving somewhere and we'll put our keys in on the hook or in the case or wherever we leave our keys. And when we go back, we know exactly where they are. But there are those times when we come home and as we walk in the door, a child is screaming, a phone is ringing, a dog is left to a deposit on the carpet, or the doorbell is ringing and we throw our keys and we run off to take care of other issues. Then when we go back and try and find our keys, that's when we can't find them because we live in the normal, in the limbic system, in the 98% of the time. So we have forgotten where we have put them because we have not put them where we normally do, and our limbic system is going to take us back to our normality. So whenever there is a situation like that, and we come in and we throw our keys, if we take a half a second to a second and say, I am setting my keys down here, if we make that cortical connection, then when you come back, you will remember that. But we typically don't. The doorbell rings, we throw our keys, we run off to answer the doorbell. and then we forgot where we put the keys. But if you can take that half a second or a second and say, I am setting my keys down here and make that cortical connection. We think we're losing our mind as we get old, and there are lots of jokes about old age forgetting. The challenge is we live more and more into the automatic. And so we become more connected to the automatic, and we live into the cortical section less and less.
Jim, question.
Certainly.
You mentioned that case of the police officer shooting the fellow with the cell phone.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say about gender differences? Because I've heard police say that women might be better at de-escalating because they don't react as aggressively as quickly. Does that have a neurological base, do you think?
That has an extreme neurological base, because in that limbic system, you have attached all of your opinions of life. You have your judgments, your prejudices, your emotions, everything is in that amygdala. So you are very correct, Bill. Thank you for that. Whenever you have that, again, the limbic will say, oh, wait a minute, that's somebody that's dangerous. So you automatically go into a greater protection. Yes, your prejudice will take over your limbic because you're not even in your cortical region.
And are there gender differences that you're seeing in the research on neurology and brain background for all this?
There are literally gender differences, yes. Without spending all night on that, but yes. The men have a stronger division between right and left brain. Women are a little more general on that. Yes, and we're going to get into that when we get into some of the neurotransmitters and why that matters. That's a good point, but we'll talk more about that. So when we live in stress, when we live in fear, when we bring stress into our lives, it automatically shortcuts us from our cortex, from our thinking. It's harder to unlearn fear. That little amygdala over there is where PTSD hangs out. If you had a horrendous experience, it is remembered in your amygdala, nowhere else. So that amygdala, however, is your protection. So it will jump up and protect you, perhaps like the over-disciplining parent. It's the overreactionary parent of us. So that's where our PTSD is stored. When you become highly stressed, the amygdala causes blood to be drawn from almost every functioning organ in your body and sends it to your muscles to prepare you for the fight or flight or whatever is going to come up, to protect you. So to protect you, it pulls blood from your stomach, stops your digestion, stops your intestine, races the heart, and creates the challenge, which is why we have digestive issues. We have all of these other issues because we're living in stress and we're constantly pulling the blood from there, sending it to the muscles. The brain is 5% of our body mass, but 25% of our energy, our blood flow. And so when we pull the blood from that, that's when we virtually sever the cortical connections from the amygdala. The other thing that stress will do is shrink the hippocampus, thusly the long-term memory. We have a greater difficulty remembering things under stress. So after you live in stress for a while, the brain forgets happiness. Thusly, depression sets in. Self-control is, I love willpower is a real thing. It takes energy to use the cortex. So when you're working on a major project and you're having to think about it, there literally is a fatigue moment that enters in. So you need to take what we call sensory breaks. Go do something mindless for a few minutes and then come back. Willpower is weakening. Mentally, self-control is mentally fatiguing. And when we are in front of somebody that we are struggling to deal with, then it really fatigues the brain, and we really begin to shut down the cortex just out of fatigue. So self-control is finite, important to know. We'll talk about that later and how to recognize. The other thing that's interesting about the amygdala, whenever maybe you drove into work and had somebody cut you off and had a very close experience, your heart races and you go through all these experiences and you finally get settled down, you're going to work, and then you go in and you tell your friends about the bad experience they had. It does the exact same thing to your body as the real experience, because the brain does not know the difference between you telling the story or the actual experience. So to relive all of these moments, which is why a lot of returning vets don't like to talk about that. They don't want to relive that. It is very, very painful to relive those moments because the brain does not know the difference. So this is a neuron. We're not going to spend a lot of time here unless you have any questions, but this is one neuron. You have at least 100 billion of these little guys in your brain. They do not totally connect to anything solidly. There's a little space in between, and they connect through fluid. The dendrites at the top are the receivers of information. The axons at the bottom are the senders. One neuron could have one dendrite, or it could have 1,000 dendrites, and the same with the axons. The dendrites are a thought. And the reason that I'm fascinated and wanted to show you this is your thought. You're sitting there thinking, why should I care about this? Blah, 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 blah. That's going on right there in that little neuron. There is an electrical current that's happening inside and out that sends a signal, opens up, causes the flow of information from the dendrites down to the axon. And then each cell is responsible for a transmitter. Each cell will only manufacture one neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is the chemical that it will send from the axon to the dendrite. And that little space is called the synapse. And in that synapse, life happens. That's everything. To me, that's fascinating. So we know about 200 different neurotransmitters. 6 are critical that I want to talk about. And many of you have heard the name of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. And these are your feel good. And when we give you drugs to antidepressants, they build dopamine. Both legal drugs and illegal drugs, unfortunately, build dopamine or serotonin. Oxytocin is referred to that as the love chemical. The dopamine makes us feel good about ourselves. Serotonin tends to make us feel good about the world. And oxytocin is the love chemical. It makes you attracted to who's ever in front of you. The mother is dumped full of oxytocin upon childbirth, making that very, very strong connection. I've always been intrigued of hearing about surrogate mothers that have carried for 9 months working with the new parents to be. They've exchanged money, exchanged everything. But at the last second at birth, the mother said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to keep the child. Lawsuits pursue and everything. what they've all forgotten is how to play with that oxytocin chemical. It fills the mother, and it also fills well, it won't fill the father, unfortunately, but the father also does have some of that same thing. During lovemaking, both partners are filled with oxytocin when you hug somebody. And so I remember reading an article some time ago, when you go shopping at Christmas time, always buy something little for yourself, buy something for other people, and then hug the clerk. Because when you buy something for yourself, it gives you dopamine. When you buy it for others, it gives you serotonin. And then when you hug the clerk, it gives you oxytocin. But be careful with how you handle the last one. But when you get sad, then other neurons enter in, and it dumps the body with cortisols, adrenalines, and norepinephrines, and some of the negative. And then, of course, what those do when you are fearful, when the amygdala says you need to protect yourself, it immediately begins drawing the blood from all your other organs and sending it to the muscles for protection. And then in that process, it stops your digestions, it races the heart, and it does a lot of other things. So that's the basic brain. Do we have any questions on the brain? I want to go to the next session. I'm sure many of you have heard of red flags, and red flags are the signs of we're getting too much, that we're getting overloaded and we need to stop and change what we're doing. So I want you all to take just a moment and take a look at the 7 questions. And sometimes this is done as a thermometer, sometimes it's done as an elevator. I love the faces. Number 1, obviously, we're very, very happy. We're comfortable. Life is good. We're moving along. At number 10, we're ready to kill somebody, or certainly feels like it. So the first one is a driver cuts you off. That used to upset me considerably. That used to be 4 or 5, maybe even a 6. And I've gotten myself to where it's fairly low now, but if you would, I'm going to give you 60 seconds just to run through those, to take a look and put a number. How angry does the driver cutting you off, or profanity, or the insults, the gossip about you, how upset does that make you? And then number 7, think about another subject. What's things that upset you? And I'll give you 60 seconds to go through those and think about those. I'm going to stop share for a moment. Did anybody have any 7 or 8s on that list? And I see some hands, but did you see some 4 or 5s? And some 2s and 3s? For those of us that have had some 7, 8s, even some 6, 7, and 8s, are you aware of what was going on in your body? Did you notice, even looking at the questions, did you have any sensation about a tightness? Because when we're in life, and when those moments do occur, we might begin to feel a little tightness in the chest, or breathing a little higher, a little less deep, little less relaxed, maybe a stomach ache if we're in front of somebody that's challenging us. So it affects us that way. The important thing of doing this, number one, when I work with an anger management class, I'll spend about an hour on number 7 alone, looking at what are those things that make us upset, where did that come from, what are the techniques we have to take care of that. The importance of all of this, the importance of looking at this and understanding the level that these take us, is that by the time we get to 5, we are no longer ourselves. We are no longer our logical selves. At that point, 5 and above, we have begun to separate our cognitive experience from everything else.
So Jim, I'm aware that others observing my behavior will point out, wow, you really blew up, and I don't feel it. And afterwards I reflect and I can see, but in the midst of it, when the adrenaline is pumping, I don't sense it.
That's an excellent observation, Bill. That's a very good awareness. But what can you take from that?
Well, I'm trying to meditate more, so I'm more aware on a regular basis of what gets the blood pressure boiling.
One of the techniques I used many years ago when I started looking at this stuff is when I would drive down the highway, I took a little stick-em note and I wrote down on the stick-em note that I will allow 3 emotional challenges. I will allow 3 rudenesses emotionally free, and put that on my dash. And when that person cut me off, I would then look at that note and I say, okay, that's 1. Now, that's comical. Did it always work? Of course not. But it began to make that cognitive connection. And that's what we need to do. How can we make that cognitive connection to that moment and that awareness? Because when we get to that level of 5 or above, we need to find a way to separate ourselves from that experience. If we're arguing with somebody, we need to say, we need to talk about this later. I would like to take a break. I'd like to step away because it's not going to end up positively for us. So that's why the importance of recognizing that.
Jim, I overheard a phone conversation, and there was the conversation was getting a little heated, you could tell. And the woman said, I need to take a step back and consider my response. I'll get back with you. I just thought that was brilliant.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Because at that particular moment, we're so emotional that we are literally just cut off our cortical section of our brain.
And I have a question. Why is it that with some of my close relatives that our entire lives growing up, we very seldom got really angry with each other, but in the past few years, because of Trump, the anger comes up constantly?
That goes back to number 7. What are our triggers? Something in Trump is triggering the relatives into a stronger emotion than they're used. They're obviously good at holding their emotions until a Donald Trump comes along, and then it's pushed them over the edge of that control. The interesting thing, Stanley, there's numerous things in what you just said. You have a man growing up in a house that's been very quiet, able to control emotions. You have a lady that's grown up in a house that tends to shout and scream and get their point across, and then they maybe get rid of it, but that's just the way they communicate. Now those two marry, and she's shouting and screaming. The husband is wondering what's going on, and it's a source of problems. It's nothing more than the way we've learned and grew up, and way we have wired our brain on how to deal with emotional moments. Some families grow up in a lot of screaming, some grow up in a lot of quiet. a lot of women have stuffed it up until the last, hopefully today. They have learned to stuff it. They have learned to be quiet. That's changing. But then when they get, then they might marry somebody that's grown up in a different environment. They're a loving couple that doesn't take away from the love, but the background and the experience and the baseology of our backgrounds are enough difference that makes communication difficult. And so these are things that we need to work out. It was talked about, and then also, like I say, number 7, and Stanley, again, let's go back and look at number 7. What are those things that really upset us? What are those triggers? Where did it come from? And then how can we deal with those specific issues becomes a valuable thing. The other thing about stress and recognizing this chart, in the 80s, we learned that the pyramid structure of management, corporate management, may not have been always the best because we're missing out on all the knowledge of employees. So in the 80s, we began team building. And so we'd get all the middle managers in the same room to sit around and talk about, maybe we'd have some operations in the same room as sales and talk about and build this team. Typically in those teams, of course, your bosses were in that team, and now we're all sitting around the round table equal, except for the fact that they weren't, and the boss was always there. And they discovered, it took them a decade to learn that turned out not to be the best system, that the best system requires just a little bit of angst to get just a little bit of adrenaline. The most creativity will happen when we're at a level of 3 to 4. So we need a little bit of adrenaline running. So we need to be comfortable challenging that person with their thoughts and questioning more, and working with people that are comfortable with being questioned. But we need that a little bit of adrenaline to create that creativity, that a flat team turned out not to be the most productive. So when we find ourselves at 5, I've got several things that I want to go through, but I want to ask, does anybody want to share some of their favorite techniques for calming down, for calming themselves, or what do they do when they see themselves in a stressful moment?
I usually just try to take a deep breath, just try to breathe, control my breathing. Because I used to, when I was young, I'd start breathing so heavy, I'd start to hyperventilate and stuff. And so
I'm going to talk about hyperventilation. That's not unusual, yes, but you're more calm now.
Jim,
I will think about the assertiveness model where at the low end, you sit and shut up and take it. At the high end, you get aggressive and fight back. And in the middle, you find a way through that's not submissive, it's not aggressive. So that model helps me.
That's great. Going from passive to assertive to aggressive. Yes, moving through that.
Jim, what I do is to try to analyze what is this emotion I'm feeling and why am I feeling it? And as soon as I kick in that analytical part, I start to calm down because now I'm using my logical brain to try to analyze. And that gives me an opportunity to think about what do I really want to have as an outcome of this situation? How am I going to respond? And what do I really want to accomplish with it?
And many of my classes, I will open with, give me 1 second of your life and I will change your life. And that 1 second is Larry, the one you're talking about, that 1 second in between the time when the experience just happened and you hit somebody. Give me that 1 second in between where we can get rational. In 1 second, I can get rational. let's go down through some of these things that I have, and we'll talk about it. And some of you have some similar. And as Marcia, as you said, deep breathing is so critical. And I talk about the 4-7-8 technique. And when you want to relax, and also this is great if you're going to take a test for students, or if you're at nighttime, if you're going to bed, do this. Breathe in on the count of 4, hold for the count of 7, breathe out on the count of 8. And the reason deep breathing is so valuable, and the reason you want to breathe out much longer than you breathe in, you have your ANS, your automatic nervous system, is two nervous systems running up and down your spine. The sympathetic, the first one, enlivens your body because it creates more blood flow, creates more breathing. Your parasympathetic slows you down, tells the body to relax, to calm down. As you breathe in, it excites the sympathetic. So as you're breathing in, it tends to excite the body. As you breathe out, it relaxes the body. As we go through life and deal with people throughout life, we tend to breathe shorter and quicker, thusly not clearing our lungs properly and getting into lung problems later. So we really need to cognitively think about breathing slower and definitely breathing out longer. Excellent. Of course, relaxation, just relax. Mindful meditation prayer, you've all done that. And Larry Donathorn just gave a great example of when you're being stressed, question your belief. What's the reality here? What is the logical response? One of the techniques I'd love to talk about is stop. Whenever you see yourself in the middle of a moment of angst, when you see yourself getting stressed, worse than that, whenever you hear yourself being negative, you have to go up in front of an audience and present, and oh, I can't do this, I'm not ready for this, I blah, 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 blah. Just think the word stop. Because what that does is immediately move you again from that limbic into the cortical section, and you become logical. Just think the word stop. Now, wait a minute. I am prepared. I can do this. Mistakes are okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's powerful. Rehearsal. So what are we rehearsing? If you've ever had a negative experience with an individual, with a place, with a situation, with a moment, and you have to go back to that same person, situation, or moment, your body remembers. Your amygdala, again, is working overtime to protect you. So when you go back to that person that you've had a negative experience with, your amygdala will prepare you. But unfortunately, it prepares you in a negative way. Now your body language is going to be such, it's in a protective mode. And keeping in mind that 100% of your emotions are expressed on your physiology 100% of the time. And maybe feel a little embarrassing, but that's the way it is. 100% of your emotions are expressed on your body 100% of the time. So when you are going back and you need to meet with that person or go back to that situation, you need to prepare yourself. How will I see this person for the first time? How will I calm my emotions before? I will do my deep breathing. I will do some stretches. I will calm myself. I will prepare and relax myself, or get into a mindset that allows me to be open and comfortable and see the situation for the first time. And Larry, as I said, if you just count to one, you don't need to count to 10.
Right.
The count to one, it's more than enough. Again, the amygdala responds in 0.2 of a second. Your cortical takes over 0.7 of a second. And remember, in advertising, in back in the 60s and 70s, they were doing flash advertising where you would go to a movie theater and be sitting there and they would literally flash a box of popcorn and a Coke on a screen for 0.2 of a second, maybe 0.4 of a second. Your amygdala says, I want popcorn. Your cortical said, where did this come from? But you go up and you get up and go get popcorn. I was also on television. The auto industry was doing it. Chevrolet would just flash the word Chevrolet for 0.4 of a second. Your amygdala would see it, but your cortical would not. That did become outlawed. Subliminal messaging, it was called. Subliminal advertising, subliminal messaging. It is illegal, but we wonder today how much of it still goes on. But again, when you have those 0.2 of a second experiences with somebody, your amygdala remembers that, and you will go off and you'll try to, and somebody will remind you, do you remember when we did such and such? And of course you don't, because it's only on your amygdala, it's not up in your sensory. When I'm working with, string a mandala, note to yourself, yeah, I do that. I put little tiny pebbles in my pocket every now and then. I start out the day. All right, today I want to focus on being more compassionate. I want to focus on listening. One of the things I teach to people on how to be kind is to listen, to do not respond for 2 seconds. Listen for 2 seconds before you respond to a question. That tells the person you've actually listened and you care. It's a fantastic tool, but I'm not always good at it. So I put a little pebble in my pocket or something silly that I reach in and say, what's this? Oh, all right. It helps me remember that thing that I want today to work on my life. For anger people, that people really have problems, or if we really have struggle with flying off the handle or out of control, if you spend a day using the opposite hand, sleeping on the other side, driving to work in a different way, eating with your left hand if you're right-handed, doing things with the opposite hand, that forces you into your cortex because you have to think about what you are doing. This is the huge value of the games of Lumosity. Those games force you to think. They may not be popular because they're fun because of that. They're not as much fun because they force you to think. But it's making that, building that highway between the cortex and the limbic system. So using the opposite hand, doing things differently now and then, studying a foreign language, that's great. Making new synapses. If you find yourself really stressed, the progressive muscle relaxation, you can do that briefly, or you can do that over a long period of time. But you tighten the muscle very tightly. You tighten your muscles very tightly as you breathe in, and just you squeeze your cheeks tight and you grab your fist, and then you exhale. And then that really just breaks down the muscle and you become very relaxed. But tighten yourself very tight and then relax. And do that on the breath. And it makes a huge difference. And bright lights help. Oh, drink a sugary drink, I should take that out. Don't drink sugary drinks, except for the fact that if you're really feeling down, yes, go ahead and have something sweet. Take a piece of candy because this is why we love it so. Sugar builds dopamine. So that will get you out, help get you out of a funk. Exercise, healthy diet, laugh at yourself. Get a book of jokes and just sit down every now and then and go through and just laugh. Because again, laughter builds all of those positive endorphins. Count to 20 backwards, again, is a cognitive process. If you're doing a test or if you're going into a situation, sit there and count to 20 backwards. That reconnects for that short, brief time, the limbic and the cortex. Creating a positive anchor. So when, just sit quietly when you're meditating or not, just sit quietly and think of the most pleasant experience you've ever had in your life. And think of that experience and see that experience, feel that experience, be in that experience. And when you get yourself into that, really that great experience that you had, then take your fingers and touch them in an awkward, in a unique way, or touch your ear in a unique way. A year later, you can touch yourself on the ear in that same way, and that will take you into that moment. The opposite of that can happen. And if any of you have ever experienced, if you're at a funeral and you've lost a dear friend and you're at a funeral and you're feeling very sad, and a good friend comes by and puts their hand gently on your left shoulder in a gentle way and say, I understand, and it's a nice feeling. A year later, you can be dancing at a party and having a great time. Somebody will put their hand on that exact same place with that exact same pressure, and you will go into that funk, not having any clue of why you suddenly feel awful. But you can do that also in a positive. Take yourself into this phenomenal creative moment, touch a unique part of your body in a strange way so that nobody will notice, and that will take you into that positive moment. And should you get to the point where you are challenge your breathing, then breathing into the handbag oxygenates. When you get too excited, you oxygenate yourself. The oxygen level rises and you get lightheaded and you can actually fall over. So that's when you can actually just cup your hands over your nose and mouth and breathe in your exhale, so that you bring in more carbon dioxide back in and bring the oxygen level back into your body. And you can do that very quick. And there's nothing like taking responsibility for your own actions to get you back into normal. Before you go to bed, take a few moments every night before you go to bed and just pause on, what am I grateful for? So you go to sleep focusing on, what am I grateful for? There's absolutely no word in the language stronger than an apology. Very difficult to do, particularly when on earth I know I'm right and the other person's wrong. Why on earth should I apologize? You apologize to get the conversation back to zero, back to where we can become at least communicative. Bring the conversation back to where we can find commonality and then move off into another direction. Forgive primarily yourself. Control your anger, control your world, or word, either one or both. Comments, thoughts? Did any of this make sense? Marcia? Marcia, you're muted.
I think it's all very interesting. I've taken some notes and all, and it's just really interesting, and a lot of things rang to me in my head, of what you were saying about different things, and just taking it all in. Thank you very much. It's really interesting.
One of the interesting things with plasticity is the ability for the brain to change and rewire. Individuals that lose an arm or a leg or a member of their body, those neurons are still wired to that part of the body that is now missing.
Huh.
Those neurons will still respond. And this is why people that lose a limb will feel pain in that member that doesn't exist. And you will see sometimes they'll fall over. It is so obvious. They know that they feel like their leg is there again. They forget. but over time, those neurons will rewire and go to another place where they can be beneficial. So the brain has that much plasticity to go where it's needed. One of the interesting stories, one of the professors was talking about, he's a piano player. He also plays the piano. So he wanted to look at his phalanges, if his phalanges had any more neuron connections than anybody else's, or if they were different. And he looked at it and he didn't see a lot difference. But he also had a friend that was a violin player. And so they took a look at the neurons in the violin player, and it was a huge difference in the fingers and the hands, because the violin player is using each finger separately, individually, to make the notes, but the right hand is holding the bow as one. So the brain wires to this. So you are literally wiring your brain.
Jim, one comment is I've had a lot of success with young people practicing these ideas you're giving out. So they'll get in groups, kids that are struggling with gangs, and they'll talk about it, and they'll give each other feedback and support for doing better with their activities, but practicing before they try to implement.
Thank you for that. One of the interesting things that all of our physical habits are down in that brainstem part. It's called the cerebellum. It's down in the brainstem. And when Michael Jordan talks about playing in the zone, you know, he's practicing, he's thinking about it, he's working his tail off. But when he gets into that game, he forgets all of that and just turns it over to the zone, which is in the cerebellum. That's the good news. What if you needed to change some of your habits? They're very, very deep. When somebody wants to give up smoking, they go through all kinds of stuff to give up smoking. 100% of the nicotine is gone from your body in less than 48 hours. Why is it so difficult to give up smoking? It's those physical habits and memories. And so it's rewiring the brain to get over that.
You know, I have a question. So this is for a recommendation. So I'm a member in Conifer here of a metaphysical book club, and a number of the books that we read kind of get into these sort of issues. The latest book was The Structure of Delight, which was really fascinating. I was wondering if you could recommend a book for us to read that would really get it in a very meaningful way at the sort of things that you were talking about. Or if you could think about that and send an email maybe.
Yes, tell me more specifically what you want. I have quite a library.
Okay, so I think that because there's a metaphysical book club, but some of the books we get into also become very scientific, but a lot of them are just about self-improvement or just how to improve the world. A lot of it has to do with mindfulness and thinking. And like the latest book that we read, The Structure of Delight, it was really about changing our perceptions, having control of our perceptions. And anyway, that's generally, but give me recommendations because I think we seem to have run out of good books to read.
Stanley, I'd be happy to recommend. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes.
Jim, I had a question. So with young people that have been traumatized over and over again, do they come to a point where it causes some issues in the brain where they're not able to actually feel because they've been traumatized?
A very big yes. The Kaiser family, the Kaiser Hospital family, years ago began studying and research, and they came up with what they refer to as ACE scores, adverse childhood experience. The doctors in Kaiser discovered that people in their 70s, they discovered that people in their 70s and 80s, their problems stemmed from very early childhood experiences. And depending on, they were able to analyze the types of diseases and know what the experiences of that childhood was in youth. It's huge. when you talk about the amygdala, what we know is people without any amygdala are serial killers. Serial killers have no emotions because the amygdala has shrunk to nothing. And we do that by living in constant stress, never having an okay moment. Yes, Michelle. That brain just, it doesn't develop. The other thing that we know in the drug and alcohol world, that when you have a child that gets serious into drugs or alcohol at say 14, 15, 16, your cortex stops growing. You start killing those new cortical connections. And so when they're 30, they might have that 15-year-old brain. They can move beyond that.
And
Comes with great
did you
effort.
say that you worked at the Stout Street?
I
And
do.
yes, and so those individuals are, and I don't want to peg all of them in one category, but it sounds like, because I have a little bit of history with that, it sounds like individuals who have been traumatized, drugs at an early age, do they have success? I mean, how hard? I would assume that the hurdles that they have to jump through in order to become fairly, I say normal, but normal like what our consideration is normal, from where they're at. It would be considerable effort on their part.
And when you consider that 95% of all the people we work with in there are what you call self-medication, taking excess drugs, taking excess booze, taking excesses, running away from those negative experiences that you were talking about. It is very difficult. It is very difficult. And it takes that cognitive to change that habit. You need something that cognitively reminds you minute by minute to change. And as I said, the cortical, it fatigues. To think takes energy, and we get tired of thinking. But
So it
again,
wears out is what you're saying. There's this,
until we rebuild it, just like any muscle, we can rebuild it. But it takes conscious effort. And that's the importance of spending a day doing something with opposite of however you would do it on a normal day. That begins to rewire and reconnect the cortical brain.
Jim, I have a question for you.
Yes, Larry.
Jim, how would you connect your thinking about anger management to the field that we call emotional intelligence?
It's 100% connected. Again, the scale of 1 to 10, that part of it is so valuable for what you're talking about, understanding our level of emotions. Most of us can deal fairly well with it. You're an exception, when you get into stress, okay, what makes the most sense here? That's where we want to get to, Larry. That's why I say, give me 1 second of your life. That's what we're working for. What makes the most sense so that we can then also, in anger management, in the 50s and 60s, we used to say, just get over it. By the 70s, 80s, we learned a mind-body connection. So we told you to get rid of your anger by going to punch a pillow. Then we realized, no, all that did was give good rehearsal. So we, then now anger management is the 3 things, one of which is where do our thoughts and feelings come from? What's our earlier experience? What is the physiology that's going on? But number 3 is learning communication skills. So learning communication skills and then learning how we can access those skills. Because if we don't learn that, if we still stay emotional, even though we have the skills, we won't use them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's let's learn the skills, but then also let's learn that element that brings us into the moment. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, indeed. The correlation in the success of people in leadership and management the correlation with emotional intelligence skills is remarkably strong, stronger than education or background or experience. And it makes sense thinking about what you're talking about, people who can manage their anger and turn it into something positive.
Correct.
Those are the people who will be successful regardless of experience and education and so forth.
And those people that grew up in the home that was passive, just stuff it, or the people that grew up in a home that was dumped their emotions openly, quickly, loudly, need to learn to balance that, bring that back into normal. You need to learn the proper communication skills. Then you need to learn how to access that in your brain.
Yes, thank you.
Jim,
Caleb,
I read an article about a year ago, which is based on fairly recent research, which is that the things that we call core values for us, which divide like liberals from conservatives, basically, that those are acquired at a very young age, like in young childhood, and that these core values are actually stored in our hypothalamus. Which is why
yeah,
it's
oh, I didn't, yeah, you know, how much did I want to say? Hypothalamus is your library. That's part of the limbic system. That is your long-term library. That's the first to go in Alzheimer's. But that's where we store all of our memories, primarily. That's the primary place. So yes, you're exactly right. And in 2 months, we're going to have Larry Donathorn, who's going to cover some of that in his discussions with the four-way test and ethics. Next month, we are very pleased to have a gentleman from Columbus, Ohio, by the name of Thomas Carlisi. And some of you, that name will be very familiar and some not. It's Tom Carlisi is, he's a trainer for the Center of Nonviolent Communication. And he is phenomenally good. It's going to be a tremendous, tremendous experience. He's been teaching the nonviolent communication for over 20 some years, the Marshall Rosenberg material. It will be a very, very valuable material on the specifics of communication. Any last words? I really like to honor the time, and so I am most thankful and grateful. And Arzu, it's a wonderful seeing you from Turkey. Allison from Wales, I know it's god awful time in the morning. I owe you a whole big bag of tea to help. Thank you for joining us. Marcia, you're in Alabama?
Arkansas.
Arkansas. I was close.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Jim, very much.
Gabe from Australia. With that, we'll say goodbye.